Welcome to Project Kaisertum, where Germany was able to capture Paris in late 1914 in the video on the top right, resulting in their eventual victory 2 years later. No need to watch the first episode, as it explains how Germany could capture Paris, while this video briefly explains the political situation after the war had Germany won. This is how the new European order would look like with the Central Powers emerging victorious, but it's soon about to change. For example, right after the Great War, Britain lost most of Ireland in our timeline, despite winning the war. This time, Britain had decisively lost the conflict, so we can assume that the Irish War of Independence would become an even bigger success. Despite this episode being part of a series, you can still watch it and see how the post-war society will develop. The exact borders are up for interpretation, as if Germany won in 1918, we would have different and more punishing borders, mostly in the east. For this scenario, I want to explore the post-war period, as Austria-Hungary is led by Charles I, the reformer king, who will start to reform the empire into the United States of Central Europe. Russia is also going to reform, just backwards, so let me show you how the world would shape before this alternate Second World War. I want to quickly mention that the Irish War of Independence, which was historically won by Ireland, started in 1919 and ended in 1921. There are two sides of the story, as historically, Britain was busy securing Ottoman lands in the Turkish War of Independence. Britain was also dealing with the Hungarian Soviet Republic, so you can say that the British army was very busy and spread throughout the world. This time, with Britain losing the war, there is no Turkish War of Independence and Hungarian Soviet Republic, meaning that the British soldiers would return home. As a result, it may be more likely for Britain to win the conflict against Ireland militarily, but I don't think the British would benefit from this move. Historically, in 1916, which is when the war would end according to part 1 of my scenario, the Irish people launched the Easter Rising against British rule, but the Irish were defeated after a week of fighting. People have said that the Easter Rising was one of the worst organized rebellions, hence why it cannot succeed, no matter if Britain has lost the Great War. I would take inspiration from this event, and for now, Britain will crush the first and initial Irish uprising. But this doesn't guarantee the British position on the island in the future. Ireland may revolt later, but for now, I think the most likely outcome is that the Irish are crushed. Still, life in Ireland is going to be tense, as the Irish wouldn't support the British, and now their country would be paying war reparations to Germany as compensation for the Great War. This would impoverish the Irish, as perhaps they'll take the burden of paying most of the debt. In other words, the average Irishman is going to contribute and be taxed more than the average Englishman. This will have several implications later, as the hatred for the British Empire would continue to grow on the Irish island. As for the British politics, not a lot would change. The country would remain being a kingdom, led by George V, but the people are going to get radicalized through propaganda. They would seek revenge. Still, the British are broke and owe a lot of money to Germany, so such initiative will not come soon. As for British politics, at the time there were two major political parties, where in the 1910 elections, the Conservative and Liberal Unionists got 46.6% of the votes, and the opposition was the Liberals, and they got 44.2%. The rest were minor political parties, although I want to mention the Labour Party with 6.4% of the votes. I expect the Labour Party to get a lot more votes, maybe rising even to 15% at the expense mostly of the Conservative Party. This is significant, as Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher were representatives of this party, with the Conservative Party losing their popularity as a result of Britain's defeat in the Great War. We may not see Winston Churchill's rise to power. The Conservative Party will lose popularity because they were pro-war even before Belgium was invaded, while the Liberals only wanted to join after Germany invaded Belgium. As a result, I think it's fair for the Conservative Party to take another hit and lose 10% of the votes, which would go to the Liberals, who would now get 54.2% and secure a majority. Britain is set to get radicalized in the future. They will have an election in 1918, so after 2 years in this scenario. The thing is that Britain didn't lose a lot of land in Europe, and they only lost a few colonies in Africa. The British are still not majority against Germany, and there are factions supporting neutrality in European wars. In fact, these factions are more popular than the ones who seek revenge. This is because Britain entered the war and lost land just because Serbia was invaded by Austria and because Belgium was invaded by Germany. None of these events had to do anything with Britain and their interests, so the British are going to drift more to neutrality and abandon France. As for the French, their politics are going to get insanely complicated. France was already a republic with free elections, but due to the loss of the Great War, some new parties would pop up. There is going to be a snap election in 1916, just 2 years after the one in 1914, where the Republican Union was victorious. Looking at the 1914 chart, no party got more than 19% of the votes. So to secure a 51% majority, the parties would need to work together in a coalition, including at least 3 major parties. Even then, France seemed to be very on the radical and left-leaning side. You can see this by their political parties' names, which are Republican Union, Republican Radical and Radical Socialist Party, French section of the Workers' International, Independent Radicals, Popular Liberal Action, Republican Left, Republican Socialist Party. You can see that about 28% of the people voted for left-leaning or radical parties. This is what historically happened in 1914, so if this time France were to lose the Great War, I think that the more likely option is for France to become socialist rather than ultranationalist. But only time will tell if I'm right. For the sake of simplicity, I will merge most of the political parties into one. We will have the Republican Front, which would have 51% of the votes, giving them a narrow majority. The left-leaning parties would also unite to form the Popular Front, and they would have 28% of the votes. The Independent Radicals will remain as an independent political party with 16% of the votes. As for the rest of the votes, there will be a new political party called French Revival, which would be far-right ultranationalist party, focused at restoring France as a global power, stopping the war reparations and seizing their former land, plus even more. This political party will get only 5% of the votes in 1916, but I expect them to grow as time goes on. Their goal would be to unite all the French speakers under one banner, including the French speakers of Switzerland, but also to form buffer states around France, making sure that Paris and France is never captured again. I want to briefly mention Germany, as not a lot would change in terms of their politics. Kaiser Wilhelm II would remain in charge and be even more popular. The German culture would be embraced as superior, as Germany won yet another war against France. In terms of economics, the war was expensive for the Germans, but not as much as you'd imagine. There is going to be a brief period of stagnation, but the war reparations from the former Entente would aid Germany's economy. I would say that the Germans would be centrist in terms of politics and be increasingly conservative. I don't think that the Germans would start liberalizing after they win the war, but I may be wrong. To briefly mention the United States of America, they are still the biggest economy in the world, but they are not interested in the European affairs. Additionally, the Americans never joined the Great War as it ended too quickly in the previous episode. The Americans are likely to remain neutral and isolationist, but want to be the hegemon of North and South America, preventing Germany and Britain from establishing influences in the region. In our timeline, the United States of America briefly occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic for several reasons, which are not important for this scenario. What is important is that this brief occupation will become a little more permanent, as the American soldiers would start building military bases on the Hispaniola island. Going east, several countries were split off from Russia, this being Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states and Finland. Speaking of the Baltics, Russia, which is led by Alexander Kerensky, will try to reclaim them, as the Russians want to secure any victory possible. Life in Russia at the time would be especially brutal, as the bread prices would be increasing and inflation would be rampant. On top of that, Russia has to pay war reparations to the Central Powers, further impoverishing the Russian state and people. This is why Alexander Kerensky would want to invade the Baltics and at least secure a partial victory, as if he sits idle, most likely he would lose his position. Additionally, since the Russian army is no longer participating in the Great War, these soldiers can get radicalized and oppose Kerensky and his provisional government. Considering that the soldiers have military training and equipment, it's important for Kerensky's government to support the war veterans in any way possible, or they would turn against him. To keep these war veterans busy, Kerensky would send them to the front lines against the Baltic countries, with the goal either to win and secure a better peace deal, or to lose a lot of these soldiers and sign a white peace. Either way would work for Kerensky and his provisional government, as if 100,000 Russian soldiers die, these are 100,000 less soldiers that would take part in a coup against his government. Thus, Alexander Kerensky would create a win-win situation, so this war wouldn't really matter for him and his government. This is because the Russian regime would prefer to send future protesters to their death intentionally. Now you may argue that this is not too likely, but let me remind you that after the Great War ended, a lot more wars started. I already mentioned the Irish War of Independence, Turkish War of Independence and the Hungarian Soviet Republic, who sparked up several wars. But also Germany was in chaos. Bavaria was trying to become communist and declared war on Germany, but also on Switzerland. There was the Russian Civil War and then the Soviet-Polish War, and these are just the major conflicts in Europe. Now, going to our timeline, assuming that the post-war period would not have any conflicts and life is going to be peaceful is just plain foolish. There is going to be plenty of instability in the first couple of years after the Great War has ended in 1916. As for Russia, they would find themselves in an advantageous position, as the Baltic states were weaker. The Russian invasion would be initially successful, but obviously the Germans would inevitably show up and take the upper hand. Russia's gains would be massive, but remember that they are fighting countries with a couple million population each, and these countries had just become independent. The Russians are near the Estonian capital city of Revel, which would get later renamed to Tallinn, but also the Russian army would capture Daugava Pills. This is because the Russians would want to maximize the chaos and get as close as possible to Lithuania, attacking them as well. As I mentioned, Kerensky knew about the German involvement and this wasn't a surprise for him. He was very well aware of the suicidal mission for the Russian soldiers, but he wasn't intimidated by the German threat. Even worse, for thousands of Russian soldiers, their generals would order them to hold the fourth city of Daugavpils, when the Germans start arriving in numbers. Since Russia is starting to liberalize and open up, at least on paper, there's going to be partial freedom of the press. Soon, stories of the upcoming Russian defeat in the Baltics would reach the nation and antagonize the people. This is why Nicholas II and the Russian royal family most likely would be put under house arrest and be stripped out of their titles, with their property and assets being seized. Alexander Kerensky would hope that this news would make it to the headlines, rather than the defeat that the Russian Empire is going to suffer. As I already mentioned, the Russian army would be forced to hold the city of Daugavpils, which would result in Germany to encircle the city. While this would come as a surprise, Alexander Kerensky is happy to see less future protesters, but also the timing of dealing with the Romanovs is just perfect. The Russian royal family would be blamed for starting the Great War, and the Tsarist symbols would be removed from every building and currency possible. Such coins as this 1 ruble from 1824, which is exactly 200 years old in 2024, would be melted. Any silver would be used for war reparations, but also to make new coins out of this. Still, the Russian soldiers would be defeated at Daugavpils, and soon the Provisional government would sue for white peace. There isn't going to be a lot of backlash from the population of Russia, as the Provisional government would secure some sort of a deal where Ukrainian grain would be exported cheaply to the Russian people, alleviating their bread crisis. You can think of this as like the Winter War, where to us, the Soviet Union clearly lost, but the Soviet propaganda made it seem like the Soviet Union actually won. The Russian Provisional government and Alexander Kerensky can therefore claim this as a Russian victory, as to them and their population they had just forced Germany to sell them cheap grain. This is far from the truth, but the Germans would prefer to end this conflict quickly, just so they can consolidate power over the new states. In the previous episode I mentioned that Lenin would still be sent by the Germans to St. Petersburg, but you may be wondering where the communist revolution is. Well, Lenin historically arrived in Russia on the 16th of April 1917. In this timeline, the war was already over by then, but Lenin is still in the city or hiding in Finland. This is significant, as for now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks will not start a civil war. The reason why they were so successful historically is because they managed to leverage the ongoing war, promising peace and bread to everybody. Now the Bolsheviks cannot promise as much and secure a lot of support so quickly. Still, there are communists with revolutionary ideas in Russia, but for now they will not rise and start a civil war like they did historically. In my opinion, without the Great War still ongoing for Russia, I think it's very difficult or close to impossible for the communists to form a government and rule over Russia. Still, a civil war initiated by the Bolsheviks is possible, but not right away. For now, Russia is stabilizing and improving. This is the flag of the Provisional government of Russia I came up with. The total population would be 134.2 million people, and Alexander Kerensky would be its temporary ruler. The GDP per capita would be $800, which is the same as 20 years prior in the start of the 1900s. This is almost half of what it used to be before the war. Finally, I bet that Moscow would become the new capital city, as St. Petersburg is close to the Finnish border, which is a German ally, but also because it was the capital of the Romanovs, which Kerensky would like to change. Going over to the Baltic states, these countries were just invaded by Russia, so them and Germany would realize that there should be a union between them. This country would become known as the United Baltic Dutchies, with this cool flag that I made, and the ruler would become Adolf Pillar von Pilchow, who is a native Baltic German. The GDP per capita would be $1,100, which is quite good, equaling that of Sweden. As for their capital, it would most likely become Riga, due to its central location and strategic position. These countries would be united as to prevent Russia from striking them and picking them one by one. Also, Germany would want to have a unified Baltic state, which this time includes Lithuania. It's technically going to be a monarchy, but for now it would remain without a monarch, as there are several candidates. Some possibilities are Wilhelm Karl, who became known as Mindaugas II, who was the king of Lithuania historically in 1918. Another option is Prince Oscar of Prussia, who was the fifth son of Wilhelm II. It's going to take some time for the country to choose its monarch, but it's going to be one that is German and that the Germans would need to approve of him first. Going to another former Russian state, Ukraine became a kingdom and would fly this banner over their territory. Their king would be Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, who historically was a Ukrainian nationalist. He adopted the name Vasil Vyshivany and even died in Ukraine in 1948. He also was a poet, writing in Ukrainian, so I think he is a very fitting candidate to serve his country, despite him being a Habsburg. The GDP per capita of Ukraine would be rough, as it's going to be around $600, which is quite low. This is because during the Great War, Ukraine was the battleground, and scorcher tactics were applied by the Russians. Ukraine was also left underdeveloped on purpose by the Russian Empire before they lost the Great War. The Ukrainians control Kiev, but they are unlikely to make it their capital considering the proximity to Russia. I would say that Odessa is the most likely option. As for their population, despite their smaller size, they would bolster the impressive 14.9 million people. The Ukrainian state will claim not only modern-day borders of Ukraine, but also the areas where there is a Ukrainian majority. Now I'm aware that this will be controversial, as some would say that the Ukrainians are just confused Russians and that such ethnicity doesn't exist, but I will use this ethnic map, where it shows Ukrainians to inhabit Rostov and the surrounding areas. Poland is another country that would become a monarchy, but choosing its king would be a difficult one. This is because the father of Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, who is this time the ruler of Ukraine, historically claimed the throne of Poland during the country's existence in 1916-1918. I'm talking about Archduke Charles Stefan of Austria. Having a father and a son control such large swath of land I don't think would be desired by the Germans, as nothing would prevent the two from not staying loyal and breaking free. It would be cool to have a Polish-Ukrainian union, but I don't think that it would be allowed by the Germans. Wilhelm II also didn't want to give the Polish crown to an Austrian, he wanted it for himself. So, historically, the only candidate that really had a shot at becoming the King of Poland during 1916-1918 was Kirill, Prince of Preslav, the second son of Ferdinand I. He was a Bulgarian, so while the idea of a Bulgarian ruling Poland sounds absurd, let me explain as it really makes sense. I will be basing my research on this document written about the event. It's in Bulgarian, but you can translate it for yourself. There it says that Kirill was also offered the Albanian throne in 1912, but him becoming the ruler of Poland really makes sense. Let me explain. This is because Kirill was a Catholic, not an Orthodox Christian, so the Catholic Poles would accept him, rather than a Protestant German. Also, the Germans and the Austrians have a history of carving up Poland, so if a candidate from these countries were to rule Poland, it would be seen by the people as these countries indirectly stealing Poland. Kirill was obviously also a fellow Slavic person, which is another plus for him and his cause to become the Polish king. Ferdinand I was also an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary during the Great War, and he historically mediated the Polish question. This is because Austria-Hungary wanted to annex the country, while the Germans wanted an independent kingdom with German influence. Ferdinand I offered Kirill as a compromise, and this time I suggest that this is implemented, as the Germans would win the war. In the document, it is said that Germany, Austria-Hungary and Poland were fine with Kirill becoming the monarch. So, considering this support, a Bulgarian would rise to the throne of Poland. If you think that there is some bias, I suggest that you read this document for yourself. Kirill would become known in Poland as Cyril I, with an interesting spelling of the word. Despite its reduced size, Poland will have 13.1 million people, 1.1 million fewer than the Ukrainians. Their capital is of course going to be Warsaw. The GDP per capita will be mixed, which is $700, but the west, closer to the German border, is going to be significantly wealthier than the east. There is also a big wealth inequality in terms of people living in the cities and the villages. Phew, that was a lot, but I want to tell you this information, as it's important for later in the series. Now I want to go back to the Balkans and go to Greece and Bulgaria specifically, who have stopped claiming each other's territory and are now working together. While to you this may seem strange, this I think is because the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be looking to dominate the Balkans. The only way for Greeks and Bulgarians to enjoy autonomy is to work together, or they would become somebody's vassal, like the Serbians did as a result of them losing the Great War. This Greco-Bulgar alliance is not one of friendship, but is one of necessity, as the circumstances call for it. Romania joining the alliance is also possible, but it's too unlikely, as the Romanians actively claim Transylvania, and Bulgaria and Greece are not looking to go to war just yet. They prefer to consolidate their new gains. Albania would get influenced by this new faction, which I would call the Salonica Pact, with this cool flag that I made. As a result, the Salonica Pact will include these three countries, with Romania being possible candidate in the future. This is strictly with the goal to prevent Austria or the Ottoman Empire to expand in the continent. Even Italy is possible to expand into the Balkans, as they claim Austrian lands, but also Albania. Speaking of Italy, they will remain more or less the same ideologically, which is they would be led by the king. There is no way for the ultranationalists to rise to power. Italy would still be in an economic recession, as they had spent a lot of money on the Italo-Turkish War from 1911 to 1912, but now also on the Great War. This was a proper Italian recession, so for now the Italians would get radicalized and prefer to stay out of any future wars. There will be a political party called Italy First, calling for neutrality, and for Italy to consolidate their new gains rather than to risk losing them. Once the economic downturn is inevitably reversed, this political party would lose significance, but for now they would be the major party in Italy, demanding neutrality. The final major power I want to mention is the Ottoman Empire, who had expanded greatly in this war, mainly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Caucasus. The Ottoman Empire was liberal when it came to religion, so all the minorities could practice their religion different than Islam for extra tax. As for politics, I think that the Committee of Union and Progress, also known as the Young Turks, would lose popularity. This is because they were more liberal and leaning towards joining the Entente, so their popularity would tank after the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers and won the conflict. Historically, in 1913, there was a coup d'etat against the Grand Vizier Kamil Pasha, who was overthrown by the Young Turks. Kamil Pasha was hostile to the group and had been determined to destroy the political party. We can expect that with the Ottoman Empire winning the Great War, that the Sultan would assume direct control over the country, which would be represented with this cool flag. The country would be guided by the Islamic faith, becoming a theocratic state. Traditional values would be embraced, and the Ottoman Empire will not industrialize as rapidly, like the rest of the Europeans, which would for sure pave the way for their collapse. I am yet to mention Austria. This is on purpose, as Charles I would have ambitions to reform the country, most notably adding a third crown under the empire for the Slavs in the Balkans. Will this secure Austria's place in Europe, or are they going to inevitably collapse, no matter these reforms? Speaking of these reforms, they will come in the next episode, so make sure to subscribe if you want to keep following the series. Thank you for watching and check the video on screen if you want to watch more. I hope to see you there.